there's a time delay between before it comes out on YouTube, and it confuses me a bit. Right. Hello.
I couldn't find the recording, so I was wondering where they were supposed to be. I found the ones from the last year's lecture,
Yeah.
but not this year's lecture.
If you Google Paul Howard Jones YouTube, then you'll go into my YouTube channel, and it should be on there.
Okay.
Let's get back. How's the old register doing? Is the register still? Some people haven't signed it. Has anybody seen it? Anybody seen the register lately? Ah, well, there it is. So who hasn't signed it? Put your hands up so we can get it to you. So if you could pass it down this way. It looks like there's a few people just in there. One of the problems with thinking about cognitive neuroscience is that the cognitive part of it, the psychology, has been evolving for a lot longer. It's been developing for a lot longer than the neuroscience. So it's quite possible that psychologists have developed ideas that don't actually have a lot of concrete basis in terms of what's happening in the brain. And memory is one of those areas. Psychologists have been studying memory for a lot longer than neuroscience has. And one of the things that, I guess it's a human, maybe it's a human trait, I don't know, but we like to put things into pairs. We like to have simple dichotomies. And that's also true in memory research. So psychologists have often divided memory into declarative, things that we can actually say out loud, like, my birthday is 28th of January, just hinting. And things which are procedural, like riding a bicycle. It's quite difficult for me to explain to you how to ride a bicycle, and yet it's something that I've learnt, it's something that I can remember how to do. So that's one dichotomy. But then they also would separate it up into other things, such as semantic and episodic. So semantic is our memory of the meaning, what something means, whereas episodic is a memory of an actual event. And not all of these have a great basis in terms of how the brain is structured, but that first one I mentioned, that declarative, or at least declarative versus non-declarative, but that's fairly sort of, procedural is one of those areas, but dividing memory into declarative and non-declarative, those things we can say explicitly, those things that we can't talk about so easily, appears to be quite a useful dichotomy in terms of how memory is stored in the brain. So that's why this diagram here, the only real division that it makes is between the declarative and the non-declarative. And when it comes to declarative, we tend to put facts and events together, and we find that the medial temporal lobe, medial meaning midline, so sort of inside of the temporal lobe, those sorts of regions, are very important for that type of declarative memory. So when we think about a lot of educational learning, that's likely to come under the declarative category, because you have to be able to declare it when you get to an examination. in order for you to get the mark. So declarative memory is very, very important for educationalists. But there are all these other types of learning, and they are related to different areas of the brain. For example, procedural learning, where you're developing a skill, seems to be quite important. The striatum appears to be quite important for that type of learning. Striatum, a subcortical structure beneath the cortex. The cortex itself is quite important for priming and perceptual learning. Cortex is very important for unsupervised learning, where you're making disassociations between things. So like pattern recognition, cortex is very important for that. Being able to recognise the difference between a dog and a cat, cortex is very important for that. We talked earlier about classical conditioning, and that can be an emotional response such as change in skin conductivity. So, that's entirely possible without the cortex being involved at all. We find that the subcortical structure, the amygdala, is very important for that. Skeletal responses and muscular responses, the cerebellum can be important for. The non-associative learning, where you learn to respond in a particular way reflexively, that can be very much involved with the more reflexive pathways, which can include the spinal cord. But the most important thing that we're interested in is declarative memory, because we have such a passion for education. And what we find is that when we do think of one particular concept, actually, although we talked about declarative memory being very much involved with the medial temporal lobe, actually a very simple memory can activate so many different regions of the brain. And when it's activated so that it's conscious in our minds and we're thinking about it, it's occupying our working memory. Working memory is our ability to hold information in our consciousness, and it is actually quite limited. This figure is often talked about as being 7 pieces of information that we can hold in our consciousness at one moment, plus or minus 2. But supposing I said to you, we walked across the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which for those who are new to the town is one of our most wonderful tourist sites. If you had a memory of already doing that, then that memory is likely to be distributed in a large number of regions. It's not just going to be in your medial temporal lobe. Shape is often associated with inferior regions of the temporal lobe. Colour, often associated with temporal occipital regions of the brain. The location you might be thinking about, that tends to be involved with the parietal cortex. So different features of that memory are going to be drawn out from different regions of the brain and brought together in the concept which you're holding in your consciousness. And that holding of information in your consciousness is likely to involve dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's a very important region for working memory. And of course you know now what dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is, don't you? Yeah? Otherwise abbreviated to DLPFC. So although we like to sort of categorize different types of memory, and we test for semantic memory, we test for conceptual memory, procedural memory, episodic memory, visual memory, spatial memory. Actually, a simple stimulus can activate all of those different types of memory. And it's quite difficult, really, to categorize different regions of the cortex as being very neatly aligned with some of these psychological categories. But let's talk a little bit more about working memory, because this is a very important concept. This is another concept that's very important for education, because as teachers we're often trying to mediate, if you like, or influence a pupil's consciousness. We want them to think about certain things consciously. We want them to hold information in their working memory. Is there really a working memory box in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? I said that it was an important region for working memory, but is that really the right way to think about it, that we have one sort of box in the brain that we just put stuff in there and then it becomes conscious? Probably not. It might be better to think about working memory really as just a persistence in neuronal firing. Now we said that when a neuron becomes active, it's outputting these action potentials, these spikes of electricity. If we can find a representation, if we can find out how the representation of something is activating neurons in the brain and increasing the neural activity of those particular cells, working memory could be thought of as just a persistence in that firing once whatever stimulus was causing that has actually gone. And that's the experiment they tried with this monkey here. And they trained the monkey to sort of look forward, and then they put in a visual cue, and they asked the monkey to try it. Well, the paradigm, they didn't ask it, but the paradigm was such that they arranged for the monkey to try to remember where that cue was after it had been removed. And if it looked in the right direction, then it would get a reward, if you like. But if it looked in the wrong direction, then it wouldn't get a reward. So it was trained to try to remember where the visual cue was. And sometimes it got it right, and sometimes it got it wrong. And they could identify particular neurons that were associated with that visual cue being present. In other words, the representation of that visual cue. So that when the cue is there, then you can see sort of an increase in firing. And then there's a delay period when it can't actually see it anymore. Sorry, no, there's a delay period, I think, actually, is when you are seeing it. And then they ask for a response. And what you're seeing here is basically when there are correct responses, the response is occurring when the firing has continued during the delay period. So the cue has disappeared, but the firing is now continuing. And as long as that firing, these are actually action potentials that are being stimulated by the cue, because we think we've found a neuron that actually codes the cue. And as long as that firing continues up to the point that the monkey responds, then we tend to get a correct response. So these three graphs of the action potentials that are being outputted by this neuron are all occasions when the monkey got it correct and it looked in the right direction. And they all show that the neuronal firing during the delay period, when the cue is not present, is persisting. Whereas when we look at occasions when the monkey did not look in the right direction, we find that the neuronal firing has at some point slowed down, it's reduced in its frequency for a period of time before the response is made. So this tends to indicate that you can think about persistence of neuronal firing as being a type of working memory. Now we still don't know how it is that you manage to sustain that neuronal firing, but persistence of neuronal firing does appear to be a basic mechanism for working memory, a basic mechanism for maintaining the neuronal representation of information from the outside world or something that you've retrieved from your temporal cortex, something from your long-term memory. You've managed to maintain it in consciousness by having a persistence of that neuronal firing that codes it. Persistence of that neuronal firing. Is that clear? Now, if that's the case, then maybe we shouldn't just be thinking about it in terms of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that actually happens to be true. So depending on the type of working memory and what you're doing with it, we actually see many other regions of the brain involved with working memory. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is most associated at least with the types of problems that we give people in scanners when we're testing working memory. But if it is based on neuronal firing, then we could be looking for working memory as coded and distributed throughout the brain. So it's distributed, but it is particularly associated with the DLPFC. Right, are there any questions about that before I go on to evolutionary psychology, which is something we have to do, because most of you are doing the BPS route, and I have to cover it for the BPS, although I'm not a great fan.
Would it be an exam as well?
Well, theoretically it might be. Yeah, theoretically it might be, because it's on these slides. But I have said I'm not a great fan. Right, so our learning mechanisms have evolved. This is true. And in fact, actually, there's a book coming out called A Short History of Your Learning Brain in 2017, which I think you should buy if I ever finish writing it. Our learning mechanisms have evolved. This provides insights. Just knowing that idea, just that idea of evolution, can provide insights at a design level. We can think backwards and say, okay, what possible prehistoric history might have justified our brains behaving in this way? And if we can't find a prehistory that could justify our brains being designed in this way, then maybe we should think again about whether they are designed in this way. So on that basis, if we accept the idea of evolution, then we should be looking back into time and saying, does this make sense in terms of what we know about where we came from? So the idea is that you have some issues in the prehistoric environment, something that might have concerned and worried us, and sorry, no, not concerned and worried us, but something that may have been important for our survival, but it probably did concern and worry us as well. And therefore, there is that indicates a specification in terms of what we need in order to survive. And actually, I don't like using the word design now. I think I want to redo these slides. But that may indicate how that influenced the way in which it evolved. The design of the brain evolved. And then we can look at the brain and the mind that we have now and ask ourselves, well, does this really reflect what we know about the prehistoric environment? It's kind of like backwards engineering, if you like. Understanding the prehistoric issues and specification helps us understand the design that underlines our mind-brain. Was there some specification that would have justified the design that we have now? If not, then maybe that's not the design that we've got. There are some interesting things about how our brain works that may have some evolutionary background. Our conditioned learning that we were talking about today is actually quite slow, isn't it? I mean, Pavlov's dog took quite a long time and got very easily confused. It only took a couple of bananas and suddenly the dog was having difficulty. And you sort of think, well, actually, why is that the case? Why can't our conditioning be a lot more rapid than that? Why can't the dog just realise on the first occasion that if there's a trumpet and there's meat, that trumpet means meat? But of course that would be actually quite dangerous, because you'd be jumping to conclusions all the time. I would always be, if somebody is wearing a coat today and they've got a blue shirt on, then I'll be completely thrown off the next day if they haven't got a blue shirt on. So you don't really want to sort of jump to conclusions like that all the time, do you? So that kind of makes evolutionary sense. We don't want to be making spurious connections all the time. That would have been a problem in our prehistoric past. Even if we could control the issue now, it would still be problematic. But then we do have the Garcia effect. So that's kind of weird, the Garcia effect. I expect many of you have had this. But if something's ever made you sick just once, it can be quite difficult to eat it ever again. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Does that ring a few bells? Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of problems with mushroom risotto. You know, and really there was nothing wrong with the mushroom risotto that I ate. It was actually some other thing that caused me to be ill. But because I ate the mushroom risotto when I was feeling sick, now if I see a mushroom risotto, I just go, ooh, I'm beginning to get over it. But it's taken many years. Well, that's an occasion of once only learning, and it's one occasion has caused that learning to occur. And you sort of think, well, does that make sense? Can our brains really be designed? Why would our brains be designed to take one occasion of an outcome, to learn, to protect ourselves? Yeah, but then when it comes to somebody wearing a blue shirt, it takes me many times to see somebody wearing a blue shirt before I become associating that blue shirt with that person. But of course, the blue shirt's not going to kill me. So in an evolutionary sense, this makes sense. It's a sensible thing that we've developed. So it's a nice linkage between our prehistoric background and where we are now, because clearly, you know, before we had all the control and food inspections that we have now, the only way that you could survive would be to remember. And if you get away with eating something once and it makes you very ill, you don't want to be trying it a second time. And then we also have things like phobias, which are fascinating. Innate species-specific knowledge. Now, should I have used this word innate? Possibly I shouldn't have done. Because, you know, we were talking about innate in a very special sense, weren't we? As being brought about by sort of molecular changes, cellular changes, not necessarily learnt on an individual basis. But actually phobias quite often are a preparedness to learn very quickly. So you may not be frightened of spiders until you see your mum running away from a spider. My mum was terrified of spiders, and I think that probably just seeing that once has always made me a little bit, ooh, spiders. So we tend, but it's very species specific, because I'm not worried about bunny rabbits or anything like that. It's you know, spiders, snakes, they're things which are potentially poisonous. We have an immense readiness to learn very quickly that these are potentially bad news. Yes?
You heard some people were scared of cows, for example? I am.
Yes, well, I was talking in general terms, but actually cows, you have to be careful with cows. There was somebody killed by a cow, I heard, in Somerset only a year ago, wasn't there? You have to be careful.
Seagulls, for example?
Seagulls. Well, some birds can be quite dangerous. Birds can attack infants, but anyway, you know, we are, of course, now we're getting into speculation, and this is one of the problems. This is one of the problems with taking the evolutionary approach. It has given rise to a lot of speculation, a lot of just so stories. For those who are familiar with the work of Rudyard Kipling, the idea, you know, that you can make up stories that appease one's playful spirit, and they appeal to you because they provide a very quick justification for, you know, why an elephant has a trunk, you know. But actually it's very speculative, and it can be quite fantastical. So we have to be very careful of these things. Evolutionary psychology is controversial for that reason, and there's been a lot of criticism of it. And particularly the Tooby and Cosmides tradition. So if you look up evolutionary psychology, you're very likely to come across their names. Sometimes that is known as the Santa Barbara School of Evolutionary Psychology, but it's probably the best known. And they make certain assumptions. They make certain assumptions about the brain, which is that it comprises a set of computationally distinct modules which support core cognitive domains. So in other words, these are genetic adaptations that have occurred that cause the cortex to specialise in particular areas of learning. And some of those particular areas are folk psychology, to understand issues such as kinship, so you can very quickly identify who's your brother and sister and your mum, and distant cousin maybe. because that would be helpful, wouldn't it, in our prehistoric past. Folk biology, being able to identify the flowers and the animals very quickly because that's helpful for food. Folk physics, being able to find your way around by the sun and the stars or whatever, and being able to construct tools, stone tools. All of these things would have been very helpful to us during the Stone Age, the Pleistocene period. And this is really where this particular school of evolutionary psychology tends to focus, on the Stone Age. And this doesn't really make a lot of sense, because our brains have been evolving for for about 3 billion years, really, if we're going back to bacteria. But we have an awful lot in common with other vertebrates. Our brain has an awful lot to do with other vertebrates' brains. For example, we have something called the basal ganglia, which is very important for our navigation and for our motivations. And we share that with the first jawless fishes that arrived 500 million years ago. And a lot of our behaviour can be explained in terms of the basal ganglia. Our reward responses, the way in which we are motivated towards various pleasures, even the way we navigate. So why focus on something that took place a mere 100,000 years ago? Our emotional biases are more likely to arise from regions of the brain such as the basal ganglia. So maybe we should be looking more at other species rather than just how we were 100,000 years ago. And we don't seem to have evolved that much since 100 to 200,000 years ago. So that doesn't really make much sense. And the other thing we know is that the cortex is really, it's ready for domain specificity, but it's not born domain specific. It's quite domain general, and it's useful for learning in all sorts of different ways. So why would it need to be genetically adapted to focus on kinship, on physics, on flowers? Because actually, there's no reason why it should need to genetically adapt in order to be able to do that. Yeah.
So are the main criticisms, for example, with the modularity model, or is it that you don't think evolution is a useful framework in which to place something like neuroscience speculatively or something like that?
No, I think evolution is a very, very important framework. That's why I'm writing a book about it. I think it's absolutely. I think evolution is an incredibly important theory. It provides an overarching framework by which we can understand the meaning of biology. And so it's incredibly important. What I'm unhappy about is that evolution appears to have been hijacked by this particular school of thought that has ignored our evolution over deep time, focused on a very small period, and not really taken into account what we know about the biology of learning, the brain. And as a result, it's produced these just so stories, these justifications. And of course, the way it works is that, and also there's been a lot of criticism of the methods that have been used. But it allows you to say things like, well, a cheater mechanism would have been really helpful. So let's go and see if people are particularly good at detecting cheating in particular scenarios. And then we find out that they are, and then that's used as a justification for suggesting we have a cheating module. But actually there could be a whole load of other explanations for those sorts of effects.
It's really easy for it to take on ideological things. Around people talk about gender and stuff as well, and it's really unhelpful in lots of ways, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, you can twist it around to sort of serve your own purposes. I think that's the worry with it, really, because you can already be biased towards particular results you think you're fairly sure you're going to get in producing experiments that happen to justify your own sort of beliefs in our prehistory, and then use that to suggest that was our prehistory. Instead, you should start with what we know about the prehistory, which is that basically our evolution began much before the Pleistocene, and most of the important changes took place a long while before then. and also include what we know about the brain. And one of the things about that is it's that domain generality of the cortex. So I think evolution is incredibly important, and I look forward to talking to you more about that when I finally get the book published, which is supposed to be due next month, so I haven't got so much longer to do it. But just to be very cautious about this particular school, I think, of evolutionary psychology. A few final messages. Our brain is ready for significant. One of the things we've learned is that our brain is ready for significant, even structural change in response to our changing environment. We've looked at plasticity, changes at a neuronal level that can occur, but actually even the structure of the brain, the size of the different parts of the brain changes in response to learning. So, interesting study that was done amongst taxi drivers showed the posterior part of their hippocampus, a region very important for visual spatial memory, is actually proportional, its size is proportional to the number of years that the driver has been driving their taxi. Which is one interesting example of how much our learning affects the structure of our brains. We see plasticity in other species as well. For example, the scrub jay. If you look at the hippocampus of a scrub jay that's caught in an urban environment, you will find a much smaller hippocampus than if you look at the hippocampus of a scrub jay caught in the wild. Because in the wild, there is much greater need for visual spatial navigation, visual spatial memory, and therefore you find that that bird develops a much larger hippocampus. And we're beginning to realise that these structural changes occur quite rapidly. For example, in the study that was done with Dragansky, he identified two regions of the brain here, this is the posterior part of the brain, related to juggling. And he was able to identify that those parts of the brain increased their size after 3 months of juggling. That's just 3 months. And then when they stopped the juggling, 3 months later, they'd shrunk back, but not to their original size, about half the size. So even 3 months of learning can induce structural changes in the brain. What we haven't talked very much about is changes in the function of the brain, so that the way in which different regions change their activity in relation to learning. We'll be talking about that in future lectures. But I just wanted to make it clear right from the start, it's not just a neuronal level that changes occur in relation to learning. So I think you're beginning to understand now, hopefully we've covered these in sufficient depth for you to know a little bit about this. Learning does often translate as memory in cognitive neuroscience. You have to be careful of that translation because educators put great emphasis on understanding. But understanding also requires memory. You have to remember the understanding. So there's more to learning than just memory, but all learning requires memory. Biologically, learning is a change in the brain structure, the connectivity, and the activity, which is the part we haven't talked very much about, the functionality of the brain, different regions being associated with different types of learning. Networks can learn by changing the efficiency of their connections. And we talked about Hebbian synapses. Hebbian synapses are ones that are coincident. This is neurons that fire together, wire together. If a neuron has already become a little bit active when another neuron has started stimulating it, then that connection is going to become more efficient. And because this one's firing when that one's already firing a little bit, they're going to wire together a little bit more. There's going to be an increase in the efficiency of that synapse. Chemical synapses are of particular interest in neurocognition, and we've had a little bit of an explanation of how that works, and that may well appear in your test. The idea that the action potential allows calcium gates to open, which then produces changes in the vesicles that surround the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are released, crossing the synaptic cleft, getting lodged in the receptors in the postsynaptic terminal, and that can produce further changes until the postsynaptic terminal is already beginning to depolarize as a result of some other neuron firing on it. Working memory we can think about as persistent neuronal firing. So it might occur in many different regions of the brain, but it is true